And thank you all for joining us. As you know, this is a very popular topic. We have had several webinars already. We had one that we did sort of a general overview of HRCs, and we had another webinar where we actually interacted with 7 different organizations and some different highlights of their HRCs, and both of those are available on our website, the recordings of those. So we were just delighted that we were able to have Amy join us today. And so when we get started, we always like to remind people of who CQL is, and perhaps for those of you who might not be as familiar with us, to know a little bit about us, why you should pay any attention to what we have to say today. Although most of what's going to be said today is from Amy. And so without further ado, I want to share that Amy Tabor is joining us today. And I'm just so excited. I've had a delightful time as Amy and I have prepared for this webinar. So I've gotten to know her a little better, and we've had great fun doing that. So Amy has an incredible breadth and depth of experience over her many years of service, all the way from DSPs, behavior specialists, to executive leadership. And you can find out lots more about Amy by clicking on the links that were on the website when you registered. We do have a couple of highlights, and I'm going to ask Amy to jump in and talk about that. Amy is the Executive Director of NAQ, the National Association of QIDPs, and their conference is coming up. Amy, would you like to hop on and tell us a little bit about NAQ before we get started?
Absolutely. NAQ is the go-to organization for IDD professionals, and it's where we learn, connect, and share with others, trying to make it enhance experiences for those professionals. So we operate webinars. We have a curriculum that we're getting ready to develop and debut in the fall. And we have what's coming up next is our conference in St. Louis. Our theme this year is On Track with Promising Practices. We're going to be at the Union Station Hotel from August 6th through the 9th. And we invite everyone to come out and join us. We've got quite a lineup coming up. We're getting ready to share the keynotes and the pre-conference this week, and just keep looking for cool stuff for our conference.
And we really appreciate NAQ. They're a great resource. So if you're not familiar with them, I'd really encourage you to do a little bit of looking into them. Amy's also the president of Organizational Dimensions, which does a variety of things. Amy, do you want to tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I wear a couple different hats. Mostly these days, I'm the NAQ Executive Director, but I also still have a consulting entity that does some work around the country. So
great. And then one of the ways that many of you probably know Amy is through her books. And we certainly have always touted them whenever we do training about HRCs. And that's why we were so excited to be able to partner with her for this webinar, because we're always saying, well, just read her book, just read Amy's book. So Amy, do you want to tell us a little bit about the books you've got available for folks?
Sure. The first one is the Human Rights Committee book, which is actually, Steve and I wrote that book originally in 1999. So it was actually the 25th anniversary. It's been updated a bunch of times and it's getting ready to be updated once again. But it's just a really good, the motivation in writing it was that it had been a requirement for a really long time. And you had this requirement, but no one told you how to do it. So we kind of started figuring out what we were doing well. People would ask us questions, and then someone asked us to write a book. And that was 25 years ago. So it's updated and, keeping with, the best practices in terms of human rights committees. So
fabulous.
Yeah.
So we're going to jump right in, and this is really just going to be kind of a chat with Amy and I. As you can imagine, we've had over 550 people register for the webinar, and as you know, you could submit questions when you registered. So as you can imagine, we have a plethora of questions. So you can be assured that your question may not be heard verbatim as you wrote it. So we went through all the questions, came up with some categories and some key kind of conversation for us to have that will kind of get at most of what we saw in those questions. Amy's gracious and is always willing to hear from you via email if you want to do that. So don't feel like your question can't be answered. The other thing is your question might be answered in that book. So if you haven't read the book, that might be a good place to start. And then at the end, as Seth said, we are going to set aside some time for some live questions. So if you've got those, you can be thinking about those and drop those in the Q&A box. All right, so the first kind of category of questions was around the committee, you know, creating it, who's on it, how often does it meet, all those sorts of things. So there's many of those questions. And when Amy and I talked, she talked about this concept of 4 types of HRC. So Amy, would you share a little bit about that?
Sure. Let me back up just a half step and really talk about why you want to worry about your Human Rights Committee, because I think that we need to set kind of the stage. And I think the first thing is really a Human Rights Committee can be your North Star within your organization. So organizations have lots of responsibilities to lots of different people. And you've got scheduling, you've got financial things, you've got transportation, you've got everything going on. And the Human Rights Committee is one of those things that can just be that North Star. A friend of ours talked about it also being a moral compass. You know, I always say that I can find out anything about an organization by looking in their minutes. And if it's in their minutes, they care about it. So it's a check kind of system for, you know, the moral compass of your organization. And the third reason why you really want to worry about it is it can aid in the prevention of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And how it does that is you find out information faster before things hopefully become a bigger issue. So that's really why you want to do those kinds of things. So the 4 kinds of types of human rights committees. The first one is really the one that you probably see more often, and I would call it the independent. And it's a standalone committee within an organization that operates just for the sole purpose of the organization. So that's type number 1. Type number 2 is something we call a consortium. The consortium model is used when there's smaller organizations who probably couldn't field a devoted human rights committee within their organization, but those committees or those organizations join together to form one consortium. The good thing and the bad thing about the consortium model, one, obviously it's a sharing of resources is really good. The downside is you've got to really make sure that you share the same values with the other people that you're working about in that consortium. The third one is what I like to call the combination committee. And if anyone's ever heard me talk about this, you know, I'm kind of passionate about how much I don't like this model. And this is the model that combines the role of the Human Rights Committee with the behavior, whatever you call it, the BMC or the BPRC, the Behavior Plan Review Committee, something like that. And the reason I don't like that model is that it takes 2 large responsibilities and tries to combine them in one single function. And often what happens, and this is my experience, and people that I talk to around the country have basically echoed this, that when those functions are combined, rights takes the back seat. And so, you know, you think about who's on the committee, right? You're talking about ABAs, you're talking about psychologists, you're talking about all those folks with all the credentials and degrees behind their name, and they're really the experts in behavior stuff, right? So that's why it, you know, tends to be that rights takes the back seat in that model. And we can talk a little bit later about the kind of the flow chart that we define and how that goes, and we worry about that. The fourth one is really something we call a regionalized one. And those are for states that do things through community service boards, and they're really related to kind of their geographic location. So some states have that model. And I think the general principle is the closer that you get to the person, the better the Human Rights Committee. So those people know those folks better when they're geographically and kind of psychologically closer to folks.
Great. And you all, I'm sure, are scribbling notes, which is great. And there is also the recording, so don't worry if you don't get them all the good stuff down. So tell us your thoughts about kind of a little bit more about who should be on the committee, how many people should be on the committee, those sorts of things.
I get that question a lot. So yeah. The answer is, like most of these things, everything's gray, right? And you have to get really comfortable with the gray, and we'll talk about that in the rights section a little bit. But there is no perfect number. But if I were to, you know, if my life depended on it, and someone said, you know, what is that number? I would say 7. And 7's just an arbitrary number to start with, right? And you need enough on your committee to make the work, you know, well-rounded, right? If you have too many, and I've seen it where it was a Thanksgiving, like the first Thanksgiving table, where there were way too many people, then it gets too cumbersome. That doesn't work either. So the magic answer is whatever works for your organization, and you have to determine that. Who is on the committee is really the most important part to that, because the success of your committee is going to come by who is on your committee. And the first part is really making sure you've got a great chairperson. And the chairperson really kind of dictates the culture and the kindness and the way in which people are going to be interact with people, and kind of the level of respect that you really want in there. So you really want to spend some energy finding someone that's a really good chair. There's some states that in Alabama, I'm from Alabama, that's one of them, that requires that the person who's the chair is not a paid staff member of the service provider. And I really kind of like that notion. You really want most of the members on this. So you've got the chair and you've got the members. You want most of your members to be non-paid. And why do you want them to be non-paid? Because it changes the relationship when you pay them, right? That makes it a completely different relationship. And when you have volunteers, they're doing it for the right reason. The other thing people often do is staff their human rights committees with employees, right? Numbers of employees, so that you get your required number of people is dictated by policies and procedures. Talk about policies and procedures for a second. It's really important that you start all of this process with really good policies and procedures. You don't want to shoot yourself in the foot by, going too high in terms of the expectations and how you're dictating things. You really want to make them real and really a guide for, folks as you're doing this. So number one, don't pay your people. And I think that was one of the specific questions. Do you offer some kind of incentive? No. But here's another part to this. If you support someone and they happen to be a member on your HRC, and let's say it's an urban area and they need money for bus fare, it's certainly reasonable to help that person do that. So that's not the same thing. That's providing a support. That's not paying a person for doing it. The other question I get most often is, it's great that you want all these volunteers. And I actually have and I call it a formula. And you have to understand with this formula, I'm not dictating that this is the formula for you. This is a formula. But the notion here is you decide on your human rights committee that, let's say again, that you want 7 people. And 7 people, who are those folks? Does your organization value academia? If your organization's values academia and you think that they could contribute, make sure you have someone from academia. And maybe that's a professor. Learned recently that in some processes, professors are required to do some of these volunteer activities. So for them to get tenure. So that was a new thing. So that might be an idea. If you value kind of the medical profession, maybe you want someone in the medical profession. That doesn't mean necessarily a physician, but it might be someone else who can kind of represent that. And I talk about pastoral stuff all the time. I've had really good luck from the pastoral community of getting people of faith into this committee. It just seems to fit, and they've been some of the best folks. So decide this whole notion of volunteerism and kind of the people that you want. And when those people leave, let's say you chose this academician, when they leave, make sure you recruit for someone in that kind of role, because it just makes sense if that formula is working for you to do that. Again, getting volunteers is hard. It's hard day in and day out with nonprofits. It's really hard for this organization. Why? Because we talk about really hard stuff, right? I mean, we're not talking about, butterflies and sunshine. We're talking about where people have been injured, where people injure themselves. We talk about all kinds of difficult things. So it's not meant for everyone. If you want to volunteer for the service provider on their golf outing, don't try and spend time trying to that person to say what you really want to do is be on our human rights committee and talk about these things. So I'd say in the recruitment, being present in the community, being out there talking about it everywhere. You can do a brochure, you can do an advertisement. 2 of my my most famous, at least to me, gets in terms of membership was a pastor actually, who called me in a random phone call. And the second one was a physician who happened to be a soccer dad when I was at one of my children's soccer field. And I won't bore you with the story. I think it's in the book, or I'll tell you, call me, I'll tell you it. But just those things where you're not expecting to get members, you get members. So it's really important to always be present and keep remembering, those kinds of things. So people definitely talk about the difficulty in recruiting people, for sure.
I I love that, Amy. It really ties into, we talk about social capital all the time. Well,
Yes,
here's another example of where social capital can definitely come into play for you. So
absolutely.
tell us a little bit more about how often you think the committee should meet, how long members should stay on the committee, should they rotate off, some of those kind of things.
Yeah, it's really hard when you talk about how difficult it is to get members on the committee in the first place and then say, oh, but they need to be, there needs to be a
Right.
cycle of something. Again, there's no magic answer. A couple of years probably, and then cycle off and get new members. I always like to keep people kind of people in the wings again, people who've maybe gotten some of the training, which we'll talk about, but keep them in the wings. So as we have that, and it doesn't have to be the same people for every meeting either. You can rotate people in at different times. It's very smart to do very helpful scheduling of meetings and like logistics to make it easy for people. So that might preclude some people from participating, right? If you have your meetings, let's say at lunchtime, and people don't have access to being available for that, then you're not going to get them. So there's some logistics things that's probably really important.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about that in our training around HRCs, is that maybe you have more than one group of folks, and
right,
maybe sometimes you meet in the evening, sometimes you meet
right.
on a Saturday, and that's good for the members, but it's also good for the folks supporters who might be wanting to come as the restrictions related to them are presented, and they don't want
Absolutely.
to leave their job or leave
Right.
their daily life. So yeah, that's a
And
great,
and people presenting themselves, right? I mean,
yeah.
people should be able to go and present their own issues for themselves. That's a really good point.
Tell us a little bit more. I know when you and I have talked, you have some real strong recommendations around that chairperson. Talk
Yeah.
more about the chairperson a little bit.
Well, again, everything goes back to that chairperson. Um, I've had some experiences that have been probably unique. I'll tell you one in particular. The story reminds me of we were supporting people in an apartment, and the staff, got the infamous packet before the person came, and they found out they were very adamant non-smokers, and the person that was going to come into the facility was a smoker, chain smoker, smoked for years and years and years and years, and they were very concerned. And somehow in the translation, it got translated that this guy was going to stop smoking before he got in the facility. And everyone listening has probably got one of those stories. Well, that really wasn't the case. And he got to the facility, and the smoking continued. In addition to the chain smoking, he wasn't a very safe smoker. So he would, he wouldn't be safe. And there were times where he would leave his lighter in his pants pocket, and staff would be helping him wash clothing, and they discover it in the dryer, and it would be, oh my gosh, this place is going to blow up because he left that in there. So what did staff do? Staff took away the lighter. So for some reason, they couldn't use matches in the day. This was a number of years ago when matches probably still existed. But so what it is, very resourceful, a really smart guy. So where did he start lighting his cigarettes? Is on the stove. Well, in addition to that, he was also somewhat forgetful, and he'd forget to turn off the stove. And when staff would come in the apartment, they'd see the gas going, and they were convinced it was going to blow up. So as a chairperson, this is all leading down to this story. I got a phone call asking me if I thought, as the HRC chairperson, it was okay if they turned off the gas because they want to make sure he was safe. And I mean, and you giggle, right? I mean, it's kind of like, okay, but then you have to listen, because I mean, it's really frustrated staff. They're really trying to do the right thing, and they don't understand that the gas also controls the heating and the other resources in the building itself. So again, by having someone who was really approachable, someone you could talk to, someone that was on the ground, that they knew, that they had seen, and those kinds of things, we were able to kind of avert something. Now, would they actually have done it? Probably not. They probably would have. But the fact that they felt comfortable with me in that instance to call and have that conversation, I could kind of walk them through it, probably prevented, some other bad stuff from happening, maybe.
Yeah.
So real important to have an approachable and someone who's not a hysteric either. I've seen those chairpersons that are hysterics, where someone gets a small cutter and they're saying, oh my gosh, we got to go and blah, blah, and that isn't a good personality fit for the chair either. You'll run into a lot more kind of extra work than you really want to.
Okay, there's so much more we could talk about the committee, but we just need to move on so we can cover. I'm trying to make sure that we cover at least a few questions in each of the topics. So
Okay.
the next kind of general topic is around training. And, what sort of training do you recommend? And are there good resources that you might be able to recommend?
Sure. Well, obviously, first we wrote the book to do that, and so I would say, those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
And it's just a kind of how to and has all those things in there. But today there's so many readings and podcasts and those kinds of things available for people at no cost, right? I mean, they're easy to access. And then I'd also say you'd be doing your members a really good duty by taking them on a field trip and taking them on a field trip to your organization and how that works. Going to see the site so they have context, right? You want them to understand those kinds of things. What else?
What about confidentiality comes up a lot when we talk about
Huge.
training? Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's the logistics thing in terms of confidentiality training, right? I mean, again, another quick story. We'd had a meeting and gotten back to my office and I got a phone call from a mama. And everyone listening has probably gotten a phone call from a mama before. And the mama was very upset. And I was, trying to figure out what she was upset about. And she said, do you know that there were two staff members who were in the local restaurant and I was sitting next to them and they were discussing the behavior plan for my child at the restaurant. And again, very practical, very small town. And it probably was, well, I mean, it wasn't, the intent was not there, right? But as I visualized it, the conversation was happening in the room. They left in the hall. They went to the restaurant together. So that conversation just happened, and then ultimately resulted in the mama hearing not good, positive things about that person's child. So confidentiality is, again, those logistics. It's about also not leaving stuff in the room. I always say that people coming into an HRC should have nothing in their hands and they should leave with nothing. And anything left in the room should be shredded. I mean, so there's not, you've gone into a meeting after another meeting and they've left things there. You want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And then, of course, all the HIPAA stuff. I would say one thing, obviously best practices that when you're discussing this, let's say there's an interaction between two people, you never use the name of the other person, right? But some organizations will go to a lot of trouble and mix up kind of confidentiality with anonymity. And anonymity would be, giving all the people numbers or some code words or something like that. In my experience, that never works. And because people are unique, they're unique creatures, right? And these things are, so everyone knew who you're talking about anyway. So it really didn't accomplish what you were trying to do. But if you put your effort into confidentiality and making sure, for example, that you have, obviously, when they sign on, you want to do a confidentiality thing annually, I would recommend doing some kind of reminder. And then in every meeting, just reminding people about the importance of that.
What about training and support for people receiving services who either might be members of the committee or they might be coming to present regarding their restriction? What sort of training and support would you recommend?
Excellent question. Everyone needs to have people receiving supports on a committee, right? But you don't want to do a tokenism thing. You don't, that formula thing I talked before, you don't want a formula saying, oh, you need to have this and this and this. It needs to be the right people on the committee, bottom line. So let's say that you're supporting a person, they're on the Human Rights Committee, and it's time for their plan review, right? And that will come up. That's just natural part of it. How does that handle? I mean, and again, you do it by policy, you do it by procedures, but there's some options, right? There's an option. Maybe the person presents it themselves if they're comfortable. Maybe the person presents it with a staff member, maybe a Q, maybe a support coordinator, someone of that, or a family for that matter. Or maybe your policy allows for you to have a conference, right? Some kind of meeting, and maybe it's just with a chair and the person, or maybe the chair and a co-chair or something like that, and keep that process more private. And then maybe just give a summary report back to the full body. That might be one option. But it's also around supporting people, right? One of the best members, one of the best things that we ever did was the first time we added a person with a disability on our committee. And I'll make the story short, but it was a dramatic change for the organization because it was no longer them. And it sounds like it's a pronoun thing, and it is kind of a pronoun thing, but it's much more significant. When we were talking about things that were going on in the room, them, those, that, and then it was us, right? Because that person was part of this. And she was a person who didn't use words to communicate. She had very limited mobility, and she needed to have a support person. In those days, she had a poster board, and she had a poster board with the alphabet and some keywords around the side. And I talk fast. I'm kind of an impatient person by nature. I learned better patience sitting next to this woman because, and she was the one who was locked in her body. At one point, she'd been locked in a facility without people with disabilities. She'd been locked in another facility. And so when she spelled her words and spoke, not a spoken word, but when she spoke, everyone listened. And it absolutely changed the dynamics of the committee just by her presence and her brilliance and everything she shared. Because if anyone understood rights restrictions, this woman understood rights restrictions because she had it done to her in a very unpleasant circumstances. So anyway, but the right person. It's got to be the right people, not just necessarily one. It needs to be right. And it doesn't have to be someone who attends programs in the provider agency itself.
Right.
You could have a reciprocal thing. You could have, hey, gosh, would you like to join ours? We'll like to join theirs. And again, when you ask people why they struggle getting people with disabilities on the committee, a lot of times the conversation is around confidentiality we just talked about a minute ago. And that should be no different from the conversation you have with anyone. People can't go back to the house that they share with somebody else and start talking about, oh yeah, we talked about your behavior plan today. That can't happen. And so again, it's making sure that those things are in place and working for the organization.
That sort of segues into a whole nother group of questions that came up around kind of the discussions, the robust conversations going on, and how do you support that, or how do you encourage that versus, where people come in, do a presentation, check a box, and they move on. How do you help the committee really engage?
Couple things. One, I think it's really helpful, and I assumed everybody else was doing it because we had been doing it. But having a summary sheet on top of the plans. Now, y'all's plans, I don't know how big y'all's plans are, but there's some plans that you're going to review that are this thick. It is completely unrealistic to think that the members are going to be able to get through all of that. So I'm a big advocate of having a cover sheet, and the cover sheet's one side of one page, and it's got just the basic facts of the plan and the person. And so that people can kind of, orient themselves much more quickly and feel knowledgeable or more knowledgeable about that. I would say also it helps to have really prepared presenters coming in who know the people. Another thing, if people, talk to me about, I can't stand fill-in presenters. That drives me crazy because the fill-in, let's say the case manager had to go on vacation and it was during the HRC time, which, hey, that happens, but the fill-in didn't know anything about the person. So basically you have to postpone and then do it again. So not a big advocate at all of having people kind of guest host for those things. But we really want to make sure that people also don't feel necessarily confident or competent in talking about it, particularly the volunteers on the committee. So again, it goes back to that chairperson to make it safe, to make the conversation go and pull or solicit information from the members is really good. Ask somebody what their opinion is. What do you think about this? And value their input and value what they're saying. And then, obviously encourage confidentiality. I think one thing that's kind of ruined it too is kind of the use of Zoom. We're demonstrating an exception, of course. But when you have those really rich conversations with people, it really helps to have people in the same room, right? You can feel the energy, you can bank off people, and you can do that better when all the energy is in the same room. So I would advocate when you can, and I realize, post-COVID and all that we've gone to, these Zoom options. But I would still encourage, as you can get that to happen, to have people come in the same room, give them a sandwich. Maybe they're doing it during their lunch hour. You get, they can eat a sandwich. Remember to say thank you, treat people well, send them a holiday card at the time, and just, kind of engage and also follow through. So you may have been discussing at the last meeting, something, really, I don't know, controversial or a high risk, right? People want to find out what happened. Did it work? Did it not work? And come back and keep them engaged. and you'll be much more successful in the whole process. At least
Yeah,
that's been my experience.
we talk a lot about closing the loop. Yeah, and making sure
Yes.
that, if the committee recommended something, do they ever hear about what happened?
Yeah. Yeah. Make sure
Yeah.
they do. Because then they're more, again, they're more apt to say something the second time when they go and have another conversation. Oh gosh, okay, so that's how that was handled. Let's think about it this way.
So after you've had this robust conversation and a great kind of examination of everything, what's your opinion? Actually, I know your opinion, but I want everyone else to hear it. Is about making decisions. Do you do that by voting? Do you do that by consensus? What do you recommend?
Consensus is definitely the preference. And you think about this, the consensus of the group is, how that it kind of goes in, as opposed to having, okay, what's Angela going to vote? Is Amy going to, all that kind of stuff. It's really not about voting. And you really wouldn't want to say, and like, let's say there's a high risk thing, you really wouldn't want to say that, it was 4-3. And we're going to go with the 4 people and not the 3 people. But you really, and again, it's the beauty of that chairperson to navigate that conversation and ultimately to reach an endorsement of, whatever the consensus of the group is. So absolutely consensus over, kind of the traditional voting.
And both your conversation about this and about the discussions and about the, in-person versus Zoom, when you and I have talked, you used a phrase which I really like. So talk a little bit about your thoughts about good, better, and best.
Oh, well, I mean, it's always a process, right? When you're starting out, you're trying to do good, and better, you do better, and then at some point, hopefully, you get to best. And it's just always that recognition that you're on that path to get better, and people get disappointed sometimes in the trainings that I do, and I always warn people at the beginning. It's like, you might leave disappointed because you're coming here probably in people who are listening as well with a very specific problem of a very something that's troubling the organization, that's troubling them as a professional, and want an answer. Well, the problem is everything is gray, right? In this good, better, and better, worse, we start out with gray. And as a young professional, it used to drive me really crazy that I didn't know, and I thought I needed to know the answer. So what I talk to people about is really, first of all, becoming comfortable with gray, because it's all gray, because it's all a new situation, because there are different people involved. And one potential solution for one person with one issue would not necessarily work for another person with the same issue. And so it's for those young professionals who are just starting out, embrace the gray and understand that it's a process, and we just keep trying to do the best that we can do.
Great. And that comes in a lot when we start talking about restrictions and having very specific questions. So several of you, even in our Q&A box today, and certainly when you registered, we had some very specific questions that are simply not able to be answered by an outside person. And I think without knowing all of the facts, and I think that goes back to what Amy's mentioned several times, is you really need to have a foundation of what are the values that you hold and have that in policy and procedure, because that's what helps you navigate the gray. Is having that common understanding and that common foundation.
And take that path for each of these situations. You owe it to the person you're supporting to do that. And about restrictions, there are 2 kinds of restrictions in my book. Well, I'll elaborate. So they're informal and formal, right? The formal ones are the ones that we know about. They're the ones that are in the plans. Those are things that we go through all the processes. And then those are those other ones, and it's the informal ones, right? And from my perspective, the informal ones scare me more than the formal ones, because at least with the formal ones, and I'll share another story. I was doing an interview a number of years ago, and I had to use the ladies' room. And I asked the lady, and it was like 4 ladies that lived in a house and 1 bathroom. And so I excused myself to go use the ladies' room, and I get to the bathroom, and the first thing I notice is that it's completely empty. It's void of everything. There's no hand towels. There are no towels of any sort. There's no soap. There's no toilet, nothing. And so I was like, oh, wow, this is interesting. And so, my monitor, radar stuff goes down. It's like, okay, this is really odd. So I'm like on a mission now to find the managers. Oh, by the way, you're out of toilet paper. And she says, no, we're not. And I said, well, just in the bathroom. And, at that point, I didn't have to use the ladies' room anymore because my whole radar thing was going off. And I talked to the manager, and she said, well, we don't keep it in the bathroom. And I said, I live in Alabama. I said, everybody in Alabama keeps the toilet paper in the bathroom. It's kind of convenient that way. And I said, well, where do you keep it? And she's like, in the kitchen. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And so, you know, I'm following, she's a shorter lady, right? And so she's going to show me where it is, right? And so she drags off the little step stool, and she goes up the step stool above the cabinet in a lock, above the refrigerator in a locked cabinet is where they house the toilet paper. Now, most of you hearing this story, this won't be terribly unfamiliar. Someone in the house at some point stuffed things in the toilet, right? And broke the toilet. And then the maintenance guy had to come over once too often at 2 o'clock in the morning. And, you know, they were chastised for, you know, whatever. And so staff, again, trying to be well-meaning and keep the one toilet for the people living there and the staff and anyone else who had to use that working, decided to take the toilet paper out. Now, the interesting caveat, which I never really exactly understood, is that they defined it when you needed to use it, if you lived in the house or anyone else for that matter, you'd go and ask for toilet paper, which again, not sure there's an inherent right to toilet paper, but maybe there should be. But you got 4 squares. And
Oh,
that
no.
was, they determined that 4 squares
Wow.
was the appropriate amount for, you know, and again, not a formal rights restriction. And I should add, no one knew about this except for the staff. So me in the monitoring mode, I get to tell the executive director, who was floored, right? Doesn't understand any of that and had no idea. So anyway, that's an example of informal restriction. Also had something happen fairly recently where it was around the holidays and we were going to visit someone, and this guy had bells, like jingle bells, like at holiday time, right? And they were sewn to his slippers. And my first thing, I'm looking at the guy, I'm thinking, wow, that guy really gets in the holidays, and staff have helped to support him. And that wasn't the case. These bells, as the staff later explained to me, were because he snuck up on people. And they wanted to hear him before he was coming. And you think about what it takes, right, to put bells on a slipper. I mean, in terms of buying the bells, sewing it on, the needle, the thread, the time to do it, never done it, so I don't really understand it. But from an informal rights restriction, I would think that that's, you know, and again, I got to be the one to tell the folks in charge about this, and they weren't happy, and they just wanted to know the name of the staff. It's like, that's not the issue. The name of the staff's not the important part. It's the culture around rights restrictions that does that. So anyway, the other thing we worry about, house rules. I'm sorry, house rules. The rules in the house. Did people have access to contributing to that, or were they just kind of imposed upon them? A lot of this stuff is around control, right? Staff wanting people to do things when staff want them to do it. Talk about a lady who, you know, she's on the schedule to do her laundry on Saturday afternoon, and it's 2 o'clock, and she's a huge basketball fan, right? We're in all this Final Four stuff coming up, right? And she doesn't want to do laundry because she wants to watch her favorite college team play, and they're getting ready to play. And the staff is saying, hey, schedule 2 o'clock, you're supposed to be doing laundry. And she's like, I don't want to do the laundry. And you can see it's not going to take too much, where that's going to, and whether it's just a verbal altercation where people are kind of messing with each other, or it turns physical, or, you know, something horrible happens. Is it really, you know, if she waits till 5 o'clock, is that okay? But, you know, trying to figure that out, and how the control issues around the house rules and all of that stuff interacts is, you know, those power struggles are really significant in terms of rights restriction, because sometimes we just don't know.
And I think that's what's really important, is to keep in mind those are all limiting people's rights.
Yes.
And so human rights committees are all about due process, and due process is all about people having a hearing when those kinds of limitations are being considered. And that's, again, what we see often is people say, no, we don't have any restrictions, but you spend time with people where they live and work, and you discover a lot of the kinds of things you're describing, Amy. And
right.
those are things that are restrictions and need to be considered through due process, right? So talk a little bit about that balancing between restrictions and support. Where's that line? How do you think about that? Talk about that.
Right. That's really tough. A colleague, most of you or some of you may know her, Tina Campanella, likes to say that rights restrictions when you try and stop someone from doing something that they want to do. That's her global thing, and I really kind of like that. And then if you add to that kind of a limitation that's imposed upon a person that's not imposed upon people in the general public, that kind of gives you the largest framework for what we're talking about a rights restriction. So as we shift to talk about things that are supports, what's really hard is that they look exactly the same, right? And in a lot of instances, they're the same thing. And for one, it's a rights restriction. For someone else, it's a support. So the first thing is really understanding what the intention is there, right? What is the intention of whatever this might be? And everyone that's gone in a question with a very specific thing, just insert your specific item, whether it's a lap belt, whether it's a whatever restriction, potential restriction that you're looking for. You want to look at the person's perspective. So the person's perspective and the intent of what it's trying to do, and then it becomes much more clear as to, is this a support or is it a restriction? If it's a restriction, it needs to go through Human Rights Committee. If it's a support, you need to document that. I mean, you do a really good job of documenting how that, is seen. You want to give yourself credit. This is part of the document. It's not a punitive thing. It's a give yourself credit for how you've thought about this and how you're supporting the person. So one of the classic examples kind of related to this is around doctor's orders. Organizations have been used to, if it's a doctor's order, we got to do this and this and this and this. And really, we've got to listen to the person's perspective of terms of that. And a dietary thing is a really good example. Let's say there's some kind of caloric restriction or something like that the doctor has prescribed, and the person doesn't like it and doesn't want to, adhere to that, then you've got that thing. And I mean, ultimately, what you would want to see is the process within the organization is having the person go back with the doctor and be honest, right? And be honest about, those kinds of things. And can they then navigate a path that really makes sense for the person? Not just, this is being imposed upon, the person and they don't want to do it. And, what's our job? We're supposed to be, supporting the people, who are living in the houses and going to day programs and doing all kinds of those things. That's who we're supporting ultimately. I mean, yeah.
So we talk about restrictions and we talk about making sure that they all come to the committee for review. What about emergency situations that come up?
Right. So the example that I usually talk about is something in the middle of the night, right? Something horrible has happened. Someone has threatened suicide. Someone has attempted suicide, and you need to do something then. Again, through policy and procedure, you need to have something in there that allows you to be able to do that, because you're not going to be able to call a committee at midnight. It's just not going to happen. And depending on how you address, things with your chair, you might be able to get that person, you might not. But as soon as the next available time is to get that together, you need to have that conversation immediately, because you can put things in place. And for example, most often in my experience, it would be increased enhanced supervision, right? So you're going to have someone that needs to have eyes on this person because of what are the severity of something. And it's a rights restriction. Enhanced supervision is a rights restriction. That's not clear to some folks either. So need to kind of make sure that we're looking at that in the same way. And then there's also one, I make a distinction between this as interim. And interim is kind of like when you're doing those things that need to happen, but they're in between the meetings. So if you only have, probably most often quarterly or monthly or Human Rights Committee cycles, right? And again, they have to cycle with the Behavior Management Committee first, right? Because you want a full review of the plan. You should never be reviewing, HRCs should not be reviewing plans that have not been vetted by the behavior stuff first. So, want to make sure that that's happening.
So
I lost my place. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. We were talking about emergencies and terms.
Yes.
Yeah, But so another thing that comes up, and a lot of questions are posed around kind of conflicting viewpoints when you're discussing restrictions. The individuals, the staff, the family, the guardian, and who potentially maybe all have different opinions or different views on whether this is or isn't a restriction, whether it should be put in place or not.
Yeah, and no one's going to pretend. Those are really hard, right? And it's really easy to get frustrated. And if you're supporting people over long periods of time, it may last a long period of time. And again, the first and foremost thing is we need to be respectful in how we do that. And we need to understand that people's journeys are very different, whether it's the parents, guardians, family members, everyone's coming from a different place. And we have to be listening to what that perspective is. And ultimately, we are supporting that person. Our job is to listen. I think one of the really good things that HCBS, the final setting rule, has done is really gotten us better tuned to that in terms of, who we're listening to and how we're listening to that. And again, document that information. I'm not going to pretend it's easy. It isn't easy. But it's how you frame it. It's how you always put the person first, keep that person central to the conversation, central to everything, and then go outwards from that.
And you touched on HCBS. Some folks had questions, kind of how HRCs play into the settings rule and that sort of thing. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. One in primary, I think, is, and it's often enlightening people, that there are no new rights discussed in HCBS. It's not new. It's the same stuff we should have been doing all along. It's just increasing the accountability and kind of putting the spotlight on them. So that's kind of the first thing. And it's another, I'm going to say the word excuse, but I don't mean it that way. It's another impetus to get us going in that direction, right? Of making sure that we're looking at rights restrictions. I was somewhere fairly recently, and a woman came up to me and says, "We just have to stop pretending they're not rights restrictions." I mean, it was just kind of, and that was kind of her enlightenment in terms of how their organization was doing things. And it's like they just pretended it wasn't, so then you didn't have to do it.
So that sort of touches on another question about how to handle potentially an overwhelming number of restrictions that need to be considered, an overwhelming amount of information, and perhaps limited amount of time at the meetings.
Right.
Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, a couple thoughts around that. One, if you have a really large organization, and what I mean, not just in numbers, but maybe geography. I've been part of one in particular, well, two, but one I'm thinking of that was over an entire state, right? I mean, geography was, I think, 6 hours north to south and maybe 4 or 5 hours east to west. There's no way you could have one committee, again, with the principle staying as close to the person as you can, that made sense. So what that organization did, I think it was 4. They had 4 human rights committees. And then they had a facilitator, not a person involved in, that person didn't vote. They didn't have a say in the outcome. They just simply facilitated. And so they were able to go from meeting to meeting and provide that continuity and then bring it back. So you have the whole representation. You can also do subcommittees. I mean, if there are particular things that, that keep coming up, you can, have a subcommittee within your human rights committee to delve into that. You could also bring in expert witnesses to, subject matter experts, not witnesses, subject matter experts to come in and talk about some things that might be helpful. Let's say if you're struggling serving some folks with Prader-Willi and you don't necessarily know enough about that, bring some folks in to talk about that. And that might help that. In terms of having so much to do in a limited period of time, I would say if you're going, and this is, I would say I'm probably on target with this. If you're going more than 2.5 hours, it's too long.
Yeah.
So you need to figure out how to do what you need to do in that efficient but thorough. And also in terms of that scheduling kind of thing, less people in the room is better. So you don't want people who are gonna, be presenting the next issue to be in the room when someone else's issue is being presented. They used to joke when I was doing it, I had chairs outside and people sat in the chairs and we brought them in and it was that time. But that, you're talking about confidentiality. That's a real easy way to better ensure confidentiality is the less number of people in the room, and only the necessary people in the room should be there.
And what about the role of the HRC in the incident review process and system?
I happen to think it's a really good idea, and probably reviewing summaries, not necessarily going through, all of them or what have you, but looking at, and here's a very specific example. You had 4 people slip on the rug at the Main Street house Um, and how are you, does that impact, kind of the quality of life for people living in that house? Looking at that, I mean, that's a silly example maybe, but looking at those things, are you having, um, an abundance of incidents that happen in the middle of the night at a particular thing, on a particular shift with particular people? I mean, looking at all those kinds of things in a summary way, and just to have the overarching data, not getting kind of too deep in the weeds with that stuff, I would say. Because again, it's a time crunch, right? You want them to be knowledgeable of that, but you don't want to weight them down with so much other, so many other things that it's just going to, take time away from that committee.
Sure. Any trends that we should be aware of nationally that you're seeing?
Well, I think certainly HCBS is driving things in their right direction. It's people wanting to be in compliance with that. So, whatever gets people motivated to wanting to do that, I think is really good. I'd say from my perspective, I think, we talk about the future of Human Rights Committee. I think the next generation is probably not going to be called Human Rights Committees.
Right.
I think it's going to be called Rights Facilitation Committees. And I'm working right now on and trying to make some of that stuff happen, because I think it's we're beyond that, right? I mean, we're really not worrying about human rights so much as we're worrying about people accessing their rights and making sure those things happen in people's lives. So I think that emphasis on the facilitation versus just ensuring, that they're there is probably the next step from my perspective.
Yeah, and that certainly fits with what we see in terms of how important rights are, in terms of people being educated and supported to understand them and exercise them.
Absolutely.
So we're going to try and touch on a few of the questions that have come up during the session. And I can just tell you that when you ask very specific questions about a very specific state's regulations or something, that's not one we're going to be able to answer today. One question that's here that's a little different than what we've talked about is, what about a right to appeal? So somebody's had a restriction approved by the HRC. What are the rights then?
So you want to you want to definitely have that in your policies and procedures. But if you think about it, if you go through the informed consent process, right? I mean, we have due process as the other thing. You have informed consent and due process. In the informed consent, if you're doing that correctly, and again, it's not about just getting the signatures, right? It's that whole thing about people understanding why these things are selected, what the choices were, the pros and the cons, and what can I do differently. Then you're better that making sure that process has occurred prior to all of this, that there's buy-in from the person, right? But then again, later on, if they change their mind, and human beings are known to change their mind, there has to be an appeal process. And again, it can be done by a subcommittee. I really haven't seen a lot of that over the years, but it's something that you need to have in place, obviously. But
sure. There's a question related to reduction plans, if you will. Sort of, is any suggestions about that? Any thoughts about that as relates to the HRC?
Give me more.
Examples of appropriate or attainable reduction plans, and how people might kind of approach that.
We're talking about reduction, like in numbers of behavioral
the
plans?
Restrictions. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, there's a reason why we call it least restrictive, right? I mean, we're really wanting to go to make sure that we've tried the least restrictive alternatives if we go more stringent, and the most stringent is medication, because we really don't know, how long medications last. The effects of those things may stay with people for a lifetime. I'm not sure if that's getting at exactly what you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. I think it's really probably more specific than we want to get into today in terms of writing behavior support plans, almost in terms of how to fade those out. Yeah.
Yeah, those questions are really kind of for the behavior folks, probably, in terms of how they're writing them, and that it's the rights restrictions that we're concerned with.
Yeah. So what are your suggestions for folks who are wanting to, or they see some opportunities for their HRC to maybe step up and be a little better when they are seeing that committee just to automatically agree or approve anything that's suggested by the behavior support staff.
So we call that, I call it rubber stamping. Right. And the rubber stamping, and someone asked me fairly recently, is that really a stamp? I was like, no, it's not really a stamp. It's the notion that anything that goes in front of the committee gets approved. And that would be a red flag, absolutely. So if there's an endorsement for every single thing, there's a problem. And you want a certain amount of things. I mean, so that we didn't talk about that. There are 4 kind of options for endorsement. So there's full endorsement. There's endorsement with kind of as presented with conditions, if they're minor things. The third one is essentially referred back. So there's some major components and it's going to go way back through the process and perhaps even start over. And the fourth one is no endorsement. You're going to run across some things where there's no endorsement. It's just going to happen. But if you went and every single thing was a full endorsement, I would say that's a red flag. Same thing with emergency endorsements and interim endorsements. And I've seen this where it's dominant, right? They're dominant. These interim kinds of things are dominant. Something's not working in your system if everything that you're having to do is an emergency or interim. So you need to rethink the cycles and maybe the order in which things are being, sent through in terms of the process.
So do you have a suggested application or questions to vet possible committee members?
I think the best thing to do is to make sure there's a values match. So for example, if your organization is very dedicated to community integration, right? There's a lot are. If you are talking to members and they express, not thinking that's a good idea, then that's probably a misalignment of values and that person probably wouldn't be as good a member as perhaps someone else. I just start a conversation and then kind of explain what it is that we do and then ask, it's kind of an interview situation, right? You're interviewing the person, maybe they're interviewing you. I mean, not in a formal sense, but it's just a dialogue. For those people that I talked about with the pastor and the physician, it was you just starting a conversation and then you see this alignment occurring and then that's when they'd make a great one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. We're getting close to time. Is there any kind of last thoughts you want to share, Amy, before we kind of wrap up?
Well, I just think that it's vesting interest and resources in this will pay off for the organization. It will help contribute to, as Art and Thane Dykstra like to say, flourishing lives. Living full and abundant lives. We want to make sure that, the things in an organization are leading it to that. We don't want the HRC to be so cumbersome. We don't want the HRC to be seen as punitive. And that's happened in my lifetime where, staff were sent to HRC kind of as punishment because something didn't go right. But if we really go in kind of that direction and make sure that everything is in alignment to make sure that we're, supporting people to live, great lives, then we're doing a good job. But don't make it too cumbersome. Don't make it too hard for people to do it because people won't do it or they're circumvent and that won't be good.
Great. So I do want to just reinforce, we have lots of questions today that didn't get answered and many that in registration, that there are resources on the CQL website. And Seth has been dropping some connections into the chat box as well. So a reminder about the NAQ conference, the book that really can answer many of your questions, then other resources on the CQL website that could answer many of them. Again, we've done several webinars already about HRCs, so you might want to refer to those if you weren't able to participate in those. And of course, you can always reach out to us, and Amy is also very gracious. You can reach out to her. So I can't thank you enough, Amy, for joining us, taking your time. I've had a delightful time kind of getting ready for this and talking about this, and we really appreciate all the people who took the time out of their day, and that you're struggling with this, that this is something that you want to do better and you want to know about. That's really the important piece. That's what Amy's talking about, the values. We want people to have full, rich lives, and this is one way to help that happen. And if that's the view that you're having, then you're headed in the right direction. And so we just need to keep doing the good work. And it's just, I like we need to come up with a little graphic about living in the gray, living in the gray. Thank you, everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.